High on the slopes of Mount Everest, frozen figures sit in eternal silence. Their eyes stare into nothing. Their climbing gear remains strapped to their bodies, preserved by temperatures that never rise above freezing. For decades, these climbers have become grim landmarks for those who dare follow the same treacherous paths. Every year, hundreds of mountaineers step over their remains, reminded that the world's tallest mountain does not discriminate between the experienced and the foolish. The bodies serve as waypoints on the route to the summit, each one a monument to ambition that went too far. These are the stories of 5 climbers who reached for the sky and paid the ultimate price. Their deaths reveal the brutal reality of what happens when human determination meets nature's absolute indifference. In October 1979, Hannelore Schmatz stood at the summit of Everest. The German mountaineer had just accomplished something only 3 women before her had achieved. At 39 years old, she had pushed through the brutal conditions of the Southeast Ridge and touched the highest point on Earth. The wind bit at her face as she gazed across the curved horizon, the curvature of the planet visible from this impossible height. Her husband Gerhard had summited the day before, becoming the oldest man to reach the top at 50 years old. The expedition seemed like a triumph for the married couple who had spent years conquering peaks together across the globe. They had proven that partnership and perseverance could overcome the world's greatest mountaineering challenge. Hannelore had discovered mountaineering through Gerhard in the early 1970s. What started as casual outings in the Bavarian Alps quickly transformed into a consuming passion. Together, they had scaled some of the world's most challenging summits, including Manaslu, Tyrek Mir, and Lhotse. Between 1973 and 1976, the couple made it an annual tradition to conquer at least one major peak. She had proven herself as a capable high-altitude climber, becoming the first German woman to summit a peak above 7,000 meters when she reached the top of Tyrek Mir in the Hindu Kush. Everest was meant to be the crowning achievement of her climbing career. She had spent months preparing for this moment, writing hundreds of letters to organize sponsorships and equipment, and coordinating the logistics of the expedition with meticulous attention to detail. The expedition required tons of equipment that had to be purchased in Europe and transported to Nepal, since proper gear was unavailable in Kathmandu at the time. The summit day began with promise. Hannelore departed from the South Col camp at 5 in the morning, along with American climber Ray Jeanette and Sherpa guide Sungdair. Despite deteriorating weather conditions, they pressed upward through the thin air. Gerhard had warned his wife via radio that conditions were worsening and suggested she turn back. But Hannelore had come too far to give up now. Under heavy snow and fierce winds, she reached the summit around 1 in the afternoon. The achievement was real, but the celebration would be short-lived. The descent should have taken only a few hours. Instead, exhaustion began to set in almost immediately. At such extreme altitude, the human body cannot recover. Every step requires monumental effort when oxygen levels drop to 1/3 of what exists at sea level. Hannelore and Ray Jeanette moved slower and slower as daylight faded. Their Sherpa guide Sungdair urged them to keep moving, warning that stopping in the death zone would be fatal. But the climbers were spent, their judgment clouded by hypoxia and fatigue. Against all wisdom, they decided to bivouac at 28,000 feet. There was no shelter, just a patch of snow exposed to the brutal elements. Temperatures plunged far below freezing as the wind howled across the ridge. During the night, Ray Jeanette succumbed to hypothermia and died. His body would eventually disappear beneath the accumulating snow. Hannelore and Sungdair faced a grim morning as they prepared to continue their descent without their companion. They made it only a few hundred meters before Hannelore collapsed at around 27,000 feet. She sat down in the snow, looked at Sungdair, and whispered her final words, Water. Water. The dehydration and oxygen deprivation had destroyed her body from within. There was nothing left to give. Sungdae refused to leave her side, staying with her body for hours despite the brutal conditions. His loyalty cost him most of his fingers and toes to frostbite, injuries that would scar him for life. For years afterward, Hannelor's body remained exactly where she died. Frozen in a sitting position against her backpack, her eyes open and hair blowing in the wind, she became a haunting landmark for every climber ascending the southern route. Norwegian mountaineer Arne Næss Jr. described his encounter with her remains during a 1985 expedition. He wrote that it was not far from camp when he could not escape the sinister guard. Approximately 100 meters above Camp 4, she sat leaning against her pack as if taking a short break. A woman with her eyes wide open and her hair waving in each gust of wind. It felt as if she followed him with her eyes as he passed by. The image haunted climbers for years. The rope that anchored her to the slope kept her in place through countless storms until 1982, when someone cut the cord. Eventually, the mountain's relentless winds claimed her entirely, pushing her body over the Kongjung face and out of sight. She had been there for years, watching over the climbers who passed. The tragedy did not end with Hannelor's death. In 1984, a Nepalese police inspector and a Sherpa guide attempted to recover her remains. Both men fell to their deaths during the effort, turning one tragedy into three. It was a stark reminder that Everest does not discriminate between the living and the dead. Anyone who lingers too long in its highest reaches risks becoming another permanent resident of the death zone. 2 decades later, another woman would earn her own tragic nickname on Everest's slopes. In May 1998, Frances Arsentiev arrived at the mountain with a dream that had consumed her for years. The American accountant from Colorado wanted to become the first woman from her country to summit Everest without supplemental oxygen. It was one of the most dangerous achievements in mountaineering, attempted by only the most elite climbers. Frances believed she had what it took. Her passion for climbing had ignited when she married Sergei Arsentiev, a Russian mountaineer known as the Snow Leopard, for conquering the 5 highest peaks of the former Soviet Union. Sergei was a seasoned military climber with technical skills honed over years of challenging ascents in some of the world's most unforgiving ranges. Together, they had become an inseparable climbing partnership, scaling mountains across Russia and North America. They complemented each other perfectly, with Sergei providing technical expertise and Frances contributing unwavering determination. Frances had already made history as the first American woman to ski down Elbrus, Europe's highest peak. She had summited both the east and west peaks of that mountain and tackled challenging routes on Denali's west buttress. Now she wanted to prove that women could endure the same brutal conditions as men at the highest altitude on Earth. The couple's 11-year-old son, Paul, begged his mother not to go. He had suffered terrible nightmares about climbers trapped on a mountain, destroyed by a storm, with no escape. The dreams haunted him, and he pleaded with Frances to cancel the expedition, but she was determined. This was her moment to show the world what she could accomplish. She reassured her son that everything would be fine. On the mountain, she said, "You are never truly alone. There are climbers everywhere." Frances and Sergei began their ascent in mid-May without supplemental oxygen, without Sherpas, and without the safety net that most expedition teams rely upon. Bad weather and equipment failures plagued them from the start. Their headlamps broke on the first summit attempt, leaving them stranded in complete darkness. They returned to camp and tried again, only to be turned back by exhaustion and deteriorating conditions. Each failed attempt left them weaker, their bodies slowly deteriorating in the thin air above 8,000 meters. On May 22nd, they finally pushed through. After days of setbacks, Frances and Sergei reached the summit late in the afternoon, dangerously past the safe turnaround time. Frances had achieved her dream of becoming the first American woman to stand atop Everest without bottled oxygen. But they had spent too many days in the death zone, and their bodies were failing. As they began their descent, the couple became separated in the gathering darkness. Sergei made it back to camp alone. When morning came and Frances had not arrived, he knew something was terribly wrong. Sergei gathered oxygen and medicine and climbed back into the death zone to find his wife. It was an act of desperate love, returning to the most dangerous place on Earth when he was already exhausted from days at extreme altitude. On the morning of May 23rd, an Uzbek climbing team encountered Frances high on the mountain. She was barely conscious, affected by severe frostbite and oxygen deprivation. They tried to help her, giving her oxygen and attempting to move her down the slope. But she could not walk on her own, and they eventually had to abandon her to save themselves. That evening, the Uzbek climbers passed Sergei on his way up to find Frances. It was the last time anyone saw him alive. The next morning, British climber Ian Woodall and South African Cathy O'Dowd found Frances exactly where she had been left the night before. She had survived an entire night alone in the death zone, something almost no one ever does. Sergei's ice axe and rope lay nearby, evidence that he had found her at some point during the night, but he was nowhere to be found. Woodall and O'Dowd abandoned their own summit attempt and spent more than an hour trying to help Frances, but her condition was too far gone. She could barely speak, her words slurred by frostbite and oxygen deprivation. Her eyes pleaded with them not to leave her behind. Her final words were heartbreaking. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." Cathy later said it was the hardest decision she ever made in her life. But there was nothing they could do. Attempting to carry an incapacitated climber down from that altitude would have meant their own deaths. They had to abandon her and descend to save themselves. Frances died that day, May 24th, 1998, just a few hundred meters from safety. Her body remained on the mountain for nearly a decade, curled in the snow, wearing her distinctive purple jacket. Climbers began calling her Sleeping Beauty because of her peaceful appearance, as if she were simply resting rather than frozen in death. Sergei's fate remained a mystery until the following year, when a search expedition discovered his body lower on the mountain. He had apparently fallen during his desperate attempt to reach his wife. The couple had died within a day of each other, both consumed by the mountain they had tried to conquer together. In 2007, Ian Woodall returned to Everest with a mission. He and Cathy O'Dowd had promised themselves they would give Frances a proper burial. It took 8 years and their entire life savings, but they finally reached her again. They wrapped her body in an American flag, tucked a note from her son into her clothing, and moved her to a more private location away from the climbing route. The same year that Frances died, another disaster had already made history on Everest. 2 years earlier, in May 1996, Scott Fisher led his Mountain Madness expedition to the summit during what would become the deadliest single event the mountain had ever seen. 8 climbers perished in a sudden blizzard that trapped multiple teams high on the slopes. Scott Fisher was among them, and his death shocked the climbing world. He had been one of the most experienced mountaineers alive, a man who seemed invincible on any peak he attempted. Born in 1955 in New Jersey, Scott had discovered his passion for mountains as a teenager after watching a documentary about outdoor leadership schools with his father. That single television program changed the course of his life. He enrolled in wilderness courses and headed to Wyoming's Wind River Range, where the mountains captured his soul forever. By his 40s, he had built an extraordinary resume that few climbers could match. He and Wally Berg were the first Americans to summit Lhotse, the world's 4th highest peak. He had climbed K2, the second tallest mountain, without supplemental oxygen, alongside Ed Viesturs and Charlie Mace. He had been to Everest before, successfully reaching the summit in 1994 while removing thousands of pounds of trash from the slopes during an environmental expedition. He was known among climbers as Mr. Rescue for his willingness to abandon his own summit attempts to save others in danger. On K2, he had stopped his own climb to help rescue struggling teammates, then returned days later to reach the summit anyway. In 1996, Scott was guiding 8 paying clients to the summit through his company Mountain Madness. The expedition was well organized, with experienced guides and Sherpas supporting the team. But problems began before they even left the high camp. In the days leading up to the summit push, Scott had descended to help a sick friend get back to base camp, expending precious energy and time. By the time the final climb began, he was already exhausted and possibly suffering from altitude sickness. The summit day went wrong almost immediately. Fixed ropes that should have been placed the night before were missing, causing dangerous delays at critical points on the route. Too many climbers from multiple expeditions were attempting the summit on the same day, creating bottlenecks at narrow sections of the path. The safe turnaround time of 2 in the afternoon came and went, but climbers were still pushing upward. Scott reached the summit after 3:45 in the afternoon, nearly 2 hours past the deadline. He was visibly exhausted, barely able to communicate with other climbers who passed him. Then the storm hit. What had been clear skies turned into a violent blizzard as climbers began their descent. Visibility dropped to nothing. Hurricane-force winds and driving snow made movement nearly impossible. Climbers became disoriented, unable to find their way back to camp, even with fixed ropes beneath their feet. Scott managed to descend to around 28,000 feet before he could go no further. He collapsed on the exposed slope of the southeast ridge, his body failing after days of exertion at extreme altitude. His Sherpa Lop Sang stayed with him, trying to help, prepared to spend the night in the death zone with his leader. But Scott told him to go down and get help. It was the last rational decision he would make. Lop Sang obeyed, though it took multiple commands before he would leave. The 2 men would never speak again. Through the night, Scott deteriorated alone on the exposed slope while the storm raged around him. He lay approximately 50 meters below a feature called the balcony, unable to reach the relative safety of Camp 4 just 450 meters below. When guides finally reached him the next morning on May 11th, they found him in a state that horrified even the most experienced climbers among them. He had exhibited paradoxical undressing, a final symptom of severe hypothermia, where the dying person feels burning hot and tears off their clothing in their final moments. His oxygen mask was around his face, but the bottle was empty. His gloves were gone, his bare hands exposed to the freezing air, the skin frozen solid. His down suit was unzipped and pulled off one shoulder, his arm hanging outside his clothing. There was nothing anyone could do. Scott was dead. Anatoly Bukriv, one of Scott's guides who had spent the night rescuing other stranded climbers, shrouded his body and moved it off the main climbing route. Scott Fisher remains on Everest to this day, his body serving as yet another reminder of what the mountain can take from those who challenge it. The 1996 disaster killed 8 people in total and became the subject of books, documentaries, and a major Hollywood film. It raised serious questions about the commercialization of Everest and whether inexperienced climbers were being led into situations they could not survive. On the same day that Scott Fisher and his teammates were fighting for their lives on the southern route, another tragedy was unfolding on the opposite side of the mountain. 3 members of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police expedition were pushing toward the summit from the northeast ridge. One of them, a 28-year-old constable named Sewang Paljor, would become one of Everest's most famous and disturbing landmarks, his body would remain visible for decades, greeting every climber who attempted the northern route with a silent warning about what awaited them above. Paljor had grown up in the rugged terrain of Ladakh, India, where the mountains were a constant presence in daily life. Born in a small village called Sakti, he learned to navigate high-altitude environments from childhood. He joined the border police and discovered a talent for high-altitude climbing that led him to this ambitious expedition. The team was attempting the first Indian ascent of Everest from the eastern flank, a challenging route that required technical skill and determination. They climbed without Sherpa support, relying entirely on their own abilities and training. On May 10, 1996, Paljor and two teammates, Tsewang Smanla and Dorje Morup, decided to push for the summit, despite worsening weather conditions. 3 other members of the team turned back, recognizing the danger. Paljor continued upward, driven by ambition and national pride. At around 3:45 in the afternoon, the 3 climbers radioed their expedition leader to report they had reached the summit. They had planted prayer flags, offered katas and pitons, and completed religious ceremonies at what they believed was the top of the world. Smanla, the most senior of the 3, decided to spend extra time on religious observances and sent the other 2 to begin their descent. But evidence suggests the team may have been mistaken about their location, possibly confused by the poor visibility and thin air. They might have been nearly 150 meters short of the actual summit, stopped at a point where the terrain leveled off and created the illusion of success. Whatever the case, they began their descent as the deadly blizzard engulfed the mountain. Radio contact was lost shortly after their summit transmission. None of the 3 were seen alive again. The next day, a Japanese climbing team encountered what they thought was debris scattered on the route. It was only later they realized they had passed the bodies of the Indian climbers. Paljor's body was eventually found, curled up in a small limestone cave at around 28,000 feet. He was wearing bright green Koflak mountaineering boots that would give him his posthumous identity. Climbers who passed the cave began calling him Green Boots, not knowing his real name or story. For years, Green Boots became one of the most recognizable features on the Northeast Ridge route. Every climber approaching the summit from that direction had to pass his body, often stepping over his legs to continue their ascent. His distinctive green boots served as a grim marker, letting climbers know exactly how close they were to the summit and exactly how dangerous their situation had become. Some used him as a checkpoint, others paused to reflect on what his fate might teach them about their own vulnerability. The cave where Paljor died became known as Green Boots Cave. It was filled with discarded oxygen bottles from passing expeditions, a testament to how many climbers had walked past his frozen remains over the years. His teammates Dorje Morup and Tsewang Smanla also perished in the storm, their bodies found nearby on the slopes. But it was Paljor's position, directly in the path of all climbers ascending from the north, that made him impossible to ignore. In 2014, members of a Chinese expedition reportedly moved his body to a less conspicuous location, perhaps out of respect, or perhaps simply to reduce the psychological impact on climbers making their summit bids. But by 2017, observers noted that Green Boots was visible again in his original position, surrounded by more rocks than before. The mountain had reclaimed its landmark, reminding everyone that Everest does not easily give up its dead. Exactly 10 years and 5 days after Tsewang Paljor's death, another climber would perish in the very same cave. David Sharp was a 34-year-old Englishman from Hertfordshire who had dreamed of Everest since childhood. He was a talented rock climber who seemed to acclimatize naturally to high altitude, earning respect from experienced mountaineers who climbed alongside him. He had already summited Cho Oyu, the world's 6th highest peak, and conquered other challenging mountains across multiple continents. He had attempted Everest twice before, both times from the northern route. On his first attempt in 2003, frostbite forced him to turn back just 200 meters from the summit. He lost several toes, but remained undeterred. In 2004, he reached 28,000 feet before retreating again, each failure only strengthening his resolve. In 2006, he returned for his third attempt, determined to reach the top no matter what it took. David's approach, to climbing was unconventional and controversial. He believed in climbing alone, without the support of guides or Sherpas, maintaining that true mountaineering meant relying only on your own abilities. He rejected the use of supplemental oxygen, convinced that pure alpine style was the only legitimate way to conquer a mountain. He had argued with previous expedition leaders about these beliefs, insisting that solo climbing without oxygen was viable even at extreme altitude. He traveled to Nepal on a budget expedition run by Asian Trekking that provided basic logistical support, but no guidance on the mountain itself. His climbing permit cost around $6,000, a fraction of what fully guided expeditions charged. He planned to start working as a schoolteacher in the autumn after returning home. On the night of May 14, 2006, David began his final summit push from a high camp on the north side. He told no one of his plans and carried only minimal equipment and 2 bottles of oxygen. His headlamp was reportedly faulty, and he had no radio or satellite phone to communicate with anyone below. The exact sequence of events that followed remains unclear because David was climbing alone. Some climbers reported seeing a solitary figure high on the mountain the next day, moving slowly toward the summit. Whether David actually reached the summit is unknown. What is certain is that during his descent, something went terribly wrong. His oxygen had run out, or his equipment had failed. By the time he reached Green Boots Cave, he was already in serious trouble. On the night of May 15th, climbers from various expeditions began encountering him, sheltering in the cave alongside the frozen body of Tsewang Paljor. The first group to find him around 1 in the morning thought he was already dead, his body so still and cold that he appeared lifeless. They continued their ascent without radioing for help. Half an hour later, another group found him and told him to get up and move on. He waved them off without speaking. More than 40 climbers would pass David that day, either on their way up to the summit or coming back down from their own successful climbs. Some mistook him for Green Boots and paid no attention, assuming he was just another dead body on the route. Others noticed movement or signs of life, but felt unable to help, their own oxygen running low and their own survival hanging in the balance. By morning, David was still alive, but completely incapacitated. He sat huddled in the cave with his arms wrapped around his knees, icicles forming on his eyelashes, and his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could not speak or move on his own. His legs and face were severely frostbitten, frozen beyond any hope of recovery. Several climbers and Sherpas tried to help him, dragging him out of the cave and into the sunlight in hopes that warmth might revive him, giving him oxygen and trying desperately to get him to stand. One climber sat with him and prayed until he had to leave to save himself. But it was hopeless. At that altitude, an immobile climber cannot be rescued. The effort required to carry someone down would kill the rescuers. There simply was not enough oxygen or strength to go around. David Sharp died sometime on May 15, 2006, in the same cave where Tsewang Paljor had frozen to death a decade earlier. He became another grim landmark on the route, his body visible to climbers for years before his family requested it be moved. The circumstances of his death sparked intense controversy. Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to climb Everest, was outraged that so many climbers had passed David without mounting a serious rescue effort. He declared that on his own historic expedition, no one would have been left under a rock to die. But others defended the climbers who had passed by. At extreme altitude, in the death zone, helping someone in David's condition was essentially impossible. The effort required would have killed anyone who tried. David had chosen to climb alone, without support systems, knowing the risks involved. His friend later confirmed that David had never expected to be rescued if something went wrong. He understood the dangers and accepted them as part of the challenge he had set for himself. These 5 stories share more than just a mountain. They share the same brutal truth about human ambition and the limits of the body. Above 8,000 meters, survival is measured in hours. No acclimatization can overcome the fundamental fact that the death zone is killing you, cell by cell, with every passing minute. Medical research confirms that no human can survive more than 48 hours at such altitude. Even with supplemental oxygen, the body wastes away. The brain slows. Dehydration becomes inevitable. The only way to live is to descend quickly and decisively. Most Everest fatalities occurred during the descent, not the climb to the summit. The exhaustion of reaching the top combines with the altitude's effects to cloud judgment and sap remaining strength. Climbers who have triumphantly photographed themselves at the summit find they have nothing left for the journey down. They sit to rest and never get up again. The illusion of safety that comes with achieving the goal proves deadlier than the climb itself. The mountain holds roughly 200 bodies today, scattered across its slopes like monuments to ambition. Some have been moved or buried by fellow climbers who felt compelled to offer some dignity to the fallen. Others remain exactly where they fell, frozen in time as warnings to those who follow. Rainbow Valley, an area below the summit on the northeast ridge, strewn with corpses wearing brightly colored mountaineering gear, offers perhaps the most striking view of this grim reality. The vivid reds, blues, yellows, and purples of modern climbing equipment dot the white landscape, each marker representing a life that ended in pursuit of the ultimate peak. The name sounds almost cheerful until you understand what creates those colors. The bodies are so numerous and so difficult to remove that they have simply become part of the terrain, permanent features that climbers must navigate on their way to the top. Hannelore Schmatz, Francis Arsentiev, Scott Fisher, Tsewang Palyor, and David Sharp all possessed courage, skill, and determination. They were not reckless amateurs who wandered into danger without understanding the risks. They were experienced climbers who had proven themselves on challenging peaks around the world. Yet the mountain took them anyway, indifferent to their resumes and their dreams. Their stories endure not as celebrations of achievement, but as reminders that Everest demands respect above all else. Gerhard Schmatz, who lost his beloved wife, later wrote words that capture the cost of reaching too high. "The team came home," he said, "but I alone without my beloved Hannelore." The lessons these deaths teach are brutally clear and apply to every person who considers standing where these 5 once stood. Never stop in the death zone unless descent is truly impossible. Set firm turnaround times and honor them without exception, even when the summit seems within reach. Listen to the warnings of Sherpa guides whose expertise comes from generations on these slopes. Plan summit attempts early enough to guarantee daylight for the return journey. Carry adequate oxygen and communication equipment. And never forget that past success offers no protection against future disaster. Overconfidence kills as surely as any storm. The mountain does not care about your experience or your dreams. Today, commercial climbing continues to grow on Everest. More people than ever are attempting the summit, many without the experience or judgment that should be required for such an undertaking. Long lines form at critical points during climbing season, creating dangerous delays that push climbers past safe turnaround times. The bodies of the fallen watch silently as new generations make the same fatal mistakes that claimed those who came before. Each season adds new victims to the mountain's toll, new frozen figures that will remain for years or decades as warnings to future climbers. Survival depends not on reaching the summit, but on knowing when to turn back. The mountain's lesson remains brutally simple. Judgment is everything.